Good afternoon and welcome to today's session on getting stuff done, how ideas become policy. We are joined by two spectacular women, leaders of nonprofits that are focused on youth. Let me just briefly introduce them, but I have to say their bios are long. Combined, I think it's 50 or 60 years of experience in Washington. So for those of you who are joining us, you might at some point want to talk to Kristin and Susan separately. Kristin Lord is the president and CEO of IREX, an independent nonprofit organization dedicated to building a more just, prosperous, and inclusive world by empowering youth, cultivating leaders, strengthening institutions, and extending access to quality education and information. She's been with IREX since 2014. She has lots of experience in other organizations in Washington, D.C., including USIP, which is a fantastic organization. She was at the think tank CNAS. She served in government, and we're thrilled to have her with us. Susan Reichle is the president and CEO of the International Youth Foundation, a global nonprofit working to equip and inspire young people everywhere to transform their lives. Susan is a longtime friend of this program and has over 25 years of working in global development at USAID. In her last position there, she was the senior most foreign service officer as counselor. She's been a mission director. She's served in lots of places, including Russia, where we first met, and was mission director in Colombia. So I am thrilled to have both of you with us today. You both lead these NGOs that tap into the vitality, the aspirations of young people on a variety of issues. But let's start with a couple fundamental questions just to get going. And for those of you who are joining by Zoom or in Hamburg Hall, be thinking of questions that you have that you would like to pose to these two leaders. We'll be coming to you in about probably 30 minutes or so. One basic question is why youth are so important. That's kind of a big existential question. But on a more personal level, you both have these long storied careers, although you're still quite young, focusing on other issues. So how did you come to be working in organizations that are so focused on youth? And let's start with Kristin.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks so much to everyone for joining us today. I will start with the bigger picture issue of why are you so important? And one answer is just a sheer numbers issue. There are 1.2 billion young people in the world today. This is the largest youth population in human history. It is just not possible, therefore, to make progress on some important global issues, whether it is climate, whether it is migration, whether it is pandemic recovery, whether it is good governance, democracy, you name it. That's too big of a percentage of the global population to ignore. But wait, there's more. This youth population is not evenly spread around the world. It happens to be concentrated in some of the poorer regions of the world, some of the more fragile areas of the world, some of the most geopolitically strategic places in the world. And let me just give you a few examples. So half the population of Niger is under the age of 15. I'm going to repeat that. Half of the population of Niger is under the age of 15. Mali, Uganda, Chad, Angola, and Somalia are all very close behind. Guatemala has the largest youth population in Latin America, with 61% of its population under age 30. Afghanistan, which, by the way, when I got this statistic, it ranked 9th in the Fragile States Index. I'd be surprised if it hadn't lost ground even more, has one of the world's fastest growing youth populations. I believe the median age is around 19, and 2/3 of the world's Sorry, my mute just went on magically without me touching anything. And half of them are going to be children living in the most fragile states by 2030. Couple more statistics, and then I'll stop with this portion. India has more young people than any country at any time in history. it's a staggering hundreds of millions of people under the age of 16. Pakistan has 64% of the population younger than 30. The median age of a Nigerian is 18 years old. And the last point I'm going to make is that a lot of these youth populations also happen to be situated not just in the most fragile states, but in the states most subject to climate change. So Niger, Somalia, Sudan, Mali, Mozambique, Afghanistan, and Yemen are among the countries most at risk. And those also happen to be on the same list of the youngest populations. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that got your attention. And in terms of answering your question about how did I come to the youth issue, I mean, honestly, a lot of my career has touched on youth. I've worked in higher education at George Washington University. Certainly IREX, U.S. Institute of Peace, have always taken youth very seriously. But honestly, for me, I'm just a strategist and an analyst, and it's just math. It's just data. You cannot make progress on these issues. So there's no path dependence for me. It's not like I always worked for youth organizations, ergo I think youth are important. It's more the other way around. I was one of the people who really drove to put youth at the center of our strategy at IREX, and it is because of the data and the recognition of their importance. It's not that I always set out to do this. So I'll stop there. You want to hear from Susan Reichle.
Well, thanks, Kristin, and thanks, Sarah, and great to see the CMU team. It's wonderful to be back. I always loved the time I was able to spend with students and of course with Sarah, Robin, and Marie, the fearless trio. So, you know, Kristin laid out the case so brilliantly. I'm not going to repeat at all what she said. She made the case. It's so obvious, as she said, with the data, the statistics, and, you know, we're not going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We're not going to make progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. And as we know, we are so woefully far behind, given what has happened in the world, without young people being at the center of our work. And, you know, just briefly to add sort of how I came to this and why this is so critically important, as Sarah mentioned, I was in the Foreign Service for 25 years at USAID in a lot of different places, doing a lot of different types of work as you do in the Foreign Service. And it was so obvious to me as I was traveling around, like, wow, I mean, if we're not really directly engaging with young people in our work, whether it's programs, projects, or policies, then again, we're not going to achieve these larger strategic goals. And, you know, for a course that is like, how do we make things happen? It is so much, as Kristin said, being a strategist, it is about the strategies and the policies we use that helps drive everything. And for me, it really came home to me when I was the head of the Policy Planning Learning Bureau at USAID. And we were developing a lot of different policies. And from our missions, from 80 different missions around the world, they were saying, you know, we need a policy on youth development. We know this is important, but, you know, USAID, you are the lead, you are the largest bilateral donor in the world, and yet there's no policy and no strategy. So we you know, worked hard to put it together with, you know, with people like Kristin and others on the outside who, you know, were working really on these issues and had the evidence and the data and you know, pushed through our first youth development policy. And that really led me, as I was thinking about my encore years, as Madeleine Albright so eloquently put it in her last book, you know, where do you want to dedicate the next chapter of your life in your encore years? And so for me, it was very clear it was all about just investing purely in young people, and fortunate to be in an organization that really was the pioneer, you know, more than 30 years ago, looking at the issue of the importance of investing in young people. At that time, with the fall of the Soviet Union, clearly people coming out of this period of the Cold War, and our founder, Rick Little, said, boy, if we don't start working with that next generation and investing, that could be a lost generation. And just, you know, in conclusion, one of the stories I love to tell is now more than 30 years ago, those youth foundations that were created, Germany, Poland, they're on the front lines right now, receiving obviously Ukrainian refugees, and, you know, completely independent, sustainable, but continuing the work of investing in young people.
You know, when I hear you guys talk about this, it seems to me you could make an argument, and probably you have, that there are a couple different ways that USAID could further elevate their game on youth. You could imagine a bureau that is devoted to this. You could imagine a cone or a specialty where, as a Foreign Service officer, you're trained that, you know, just like you'd be a democracy, human rights, or governance officer, you might be a youth officer. Or you could have, I suppose, specialized people in each of the bureaus that are dedicated to youth and have a youth team. There's reorientation going on in USAID. Do we see any of that happening?
Yes, absolutely. I'll kick it off. As you know, in the first youth policy, it actually called for a youth coordinator across the agency. And fortunately, we had an outstanding youth coordinator who's now the head of Latin America regional director at Peace Corps, Mike McCabe. But that youth coordinator position helped create the champions, helped create, because good point, Sarah. The point I think for all of you who are, you know, really practitioners and future policy leaders, emerging policy leaders, is you can have policies and strategies, but in the end, if you don't have people, you don't have budgets, you don't have programs, that policy sits on a shelf. And so what we worked really hard to do was to actually put the bones around how do we make it real. And where we are today, the policy was updated and launched in April, and working hard to have those positions now in the missions, in the USAID missions, where people are, you know, not just youth. They can't just be youth advisors, but this is how we started with gender, right? I was the Nicaragua, you know, women and girls advisor without any training. And I think because I was the youngest woman in the mission, they just threw me in there. And what do? You start to network, you start to learn about the importance of gender, start to advocate. You know, that's what's happening right now, I think, within USAID around not just youth, but other issues related to inclusion, which are critically important as well.
I take your point about people and budgets. We're going to pivot a little bit. I want to hear about your organizations. Tell us a little bit, because they've been around for quite some time. And I imagine in the year 2022, they're different than they looked previously. Kristin, do you want to start? And then we'll go to Susan.
Sure, I'm happy to do that, Sarah. The history of IREX is really as an exchange organization with the former, what is now the former Soviet Union. Literally thousands and thousands and thousands of people went back and forth between the US and the Soviet bloc during a period of great geopolitical tension. It wasn't out of a perspective of naivete that if we just knew each other, you know, we wouldn't have to worry about nuclear war or anything like that. It was a very pragmatic view that, you know, at that time there was so little information, so little knowledge, basic knowledge about what was happening inside the Soviet bloc, and people who lived there had so little information about what it was really like in a democratic country like the US. So really the idea was to just provide some basic information and some connecting points, and people who could then serve as resources for their own society. So that's where we started from, and we're still an exchange organization. We still run a lot of exchange programs for young people in Pakistan, Tunisia. We implement the Young African Leaders Initiative, the Mandela Washington Fellows Program, which is one of the, I think, greatest youth leaders programs of all time. We still run Fulbright programs. We run Young Leaders of the Americas Initiative on behalf of the U.S. State Department and USAID and others. So that's still very much who IREX is today. But another real pivot point for us was the end of the Cold War. We became a go-to organization investing in what I'd call the foundations of democratic societies. So independent civil society, independent media, education reform. IREX now does that globally, but it really started in Eurasia. Getting back to the issue of youth, when I look back at the history, youth was always part of IREX. IREX always had a large percentage of our participants who were young people, just as a side effect of the nature of our work. You know, we wanted the people who were up and coming, and we're going to drive change, not people who were very invested in the status quo. But it was only, I would say, several years ago when I came to IREX that we looked around and said, why aren't we being more explicit about how critical youth people are to promoting more just, prosperous, and inclusive societies with our mission. Why aren't we being more intentional about the resources we have, what we know, what we need to know in order to be better at youth development? And so to me, this is a good example of where strategies can matter, is that they lead not just individuals, but a whole organization to focus on a whole audience and how you serve them better and how you leverage your existing work better. So I'm going to leave it with that. We can come back, but that's really the story of IREX's evolution and how we came to much more intentionally focus on this youth demographic.
Susan, you've been with IYF since, I want to say 2017, but yes, wow.
Yeah.
That's 5 years ago.
I know.
And you were stepping into a position where a president had been there for a long time, and then you were coming in as a new president. So tell us a little bit about that evolution.
Yeah. Well, just to add to the story I told beforehand about IYF, two things I think, again, from a practitioner policy piece that are important to know. When Rick Little, our founder, created IYF, as I mentioned, it was with a vision of investing in young people, but as partners, right? Positive youth development, which is so common now, looking at young people as truly partners, as Kristin said, agents of change. That was not common back in 1990. And so he created that. And he also created it with, this idea of creating mini foundations that were all locally led, locally run. That has been part of the IYF DNA from the beginning. And we were fortunate to have the largest grant at the, because the Gates Foundation didn't exist. Kellogg Foundation gave IYF $75 million in order to do this. But they reached a pivot point in 96. And I'm telling this story because I think there's so many lessons here. If they had continued on this model of creating mini foundations, and their funding base, obviously, with the foundation money was ending, the corporate money was coming up, USAID hadn't really discovered, frankly, youth development yet, so there wasn't much there. They shifted models and went from locally led foundations that were being created to working through local partners. And I tell them that was a real pivot point for IYF. It wouldn't exist today had they not made that real strategic decision, just as Kristin was describing with IREX. There are times you have to really step back from the day-to-day and question your operational model and say, how do we pivot for what the need is in the globe? And in that case with IYF, it enabled them to go global. Now, having worked in more than 100 countries with always through local partners. And when we do have local offices, they're all locally led. We don't put expats overseas unless the donor requires it. And one of the few donors is USAID who requires it, but we've been able to avoid it, since then. And I tell this story because I think we're at an inflection point in development where we're really questioning our model and how we work. And that's a good thing, because that's what drives change forward. That's what drives innovative approaches forward. And so now coming fast forward to where we are today. And when I joined, I had the good fortune of, having a time to overlap with my predecessor and then sort of chart our own path with our strategy, which is Transformation 2025 strategy, 3 strategic pillars of unlocking youth agency, connecting young people to economic opportunity, and systems change, which really undergirds everything. And that has enabled us within the pandemic to reimagine also how we're working. Again, you have these points, and you all will have this in your careers, where you have to be able to step back and say, what got us here won't get us there. What is the world saying we need to do differently? And in our case, obviously, it's always where youth are, right? And so young people, putting climate change front and center within those strategic pillars of youth agency, economic opportunity, and systems change. Mental health. Obviously something absolutely critical right now when investing and partnering with young people. So that's enabled, I think, all of us to, we just always have to stay on our toes. We have to be looking over the horizon. And as all of you as emerging leaders, it's one of the things that sometimes can be the hardest to do, but it's the most rewarding. It's where Kristin and I just get a lot of energy off of each other, batting around different ideas and how we can help drive change forward.
So we may go back to this issue of localization since it's such a hot topic in global development, but also at AID. But inside your own organizations, how do you ensure that youth voices are heard? And I say this as we're going to pivot shortly to the youth voices that are with us today. But how do you make sure that those voices are heard?
So I'll start, and then I know you'll have things to add, Susan. And I'm going to add some things that are hard to Sarah. So we're not just talking about, it doesn't sound like a commercial, because this is not easy. The first thing is we hire a lot of young staff everywhere in the world. We don't hire very many people who are, for instance, my age. And I think that's actually very important because the people who are running your programs need to be able to deeply embed and deeply relate to the constituents they're working with. So that's the obvious thing. A second thing is we're very much organized around projects, which most of the development community is. There are pluses and minuses to that. But for individual projects, it is a very common feature of our youth programs to have some kind of a youth advisory council. And I think the key there is to actually listen and actually engage them. And that gets me to the point I want to say is a little harder. It has come up at various points. We should have youth members of our board and so on. But having people who are really engaged at the same level, and there's not either the practice or appearance of tokenism, I think is a real challenge, especially when you're talking about young people who may be in lower bandwidth communities, who have fewer resources, who may be elsewhere in the world, having them interact as equal players with your board members or your senior staff, I think is much harder. And I know for my organization, we have decided we would rather lag than ever actually tokenize youth or make them feel that they are being tokenized. So we're very focused on how to do it well. And so I think we've been more successful at the level of the project because it is much easier to do that in an authentic way, to really listen, to really engage, have people on an equal footing. It is much harder when you're talking about, for instance, board governance of a $130 million organization like ours. I'm not saying we wouldn't do it, but when we do it, we want to do it well.
Well, that was frank, and I appreciate that. I mean, given the fact that you are very project driven, it does mean that you've got youth in the nitty gritty of everything that's going on every day. Susan, how about you guys?
Yeah, I mean, for IYF, again, it was sort of built into the DNA, but flash forward to where we are today, more than half of our organization is under the age of 30. So that's been just, again, built into the DNA. And it was interesting because when I joined, they used to have a young professionals network across IYF. And then those people have risen to be CFOs, vice presidents. Now they're off running their own organizations. But then it kind of faded away. And the pandemic actually helped us bring that back in a different way. So it's now the emerging leaders of IYF. It's global. They are unbelievably driven and they keep us on our toes. It also helps, as Kristin said, there are very few our age. I'm the only one over the age of 50. So there is just a totally different, and coming from the Foreign Service, very different demographic to IYF. I've learned a lot. And then as Kristin said, obviously in all our programs, but the emerging leaders really they're part of the senior leadership team. They're part of our decision-making process. On the board, and again, I was fortunate to really inherit this. IYF started having youth board members 20 years ago. As a matter of fact, last week, we had many of them fly in for our board meeting who were former board members and a dinner and a celebratory. And, partly, I think why we've been able to do that in an authentic way and where they're really involved, they're social entrepreneurs. And so it's sort of, they're already leaders in their own communities. But I have learned what I did really, and now a quarter of our board are young leaders, okay? But picking up on what Kristin said, the thing we have to do really intentionally is equip them to be at the board meetings, to be on the committees with people who are corporate titans, frankly, who I have on my board. And that can be a little intimidating. And when I got to IYF, I noticed they weren't speaking, the young board members. And I was like, this isn't good. I mean, you know, great to have her from Kenya here, and she's doing amazing work there, but I want her to feel like she does not only deserves a seat at the table, she needs to be heard. And so we've worked really hard in doing that, and investing the resources. You have to, that when you have youth engagement, and I really want to make this point strongly, because I think we just assume young people would love to be at the table. No, I mean, absolutely not. They deserve to be at the table. They should be paid to be at the table. We need to create that space for them. And that's still something that's a huge work in progress, not just obviously in the development community, but across the globe, whether it's in government, UN. I'll stop because I could go on one of my rants on that one, because it's just such a needed area for work by all of us in leadership positions.
Well, speaking of youth voices, we got 2 hands up, so I'm going to go to Jill and then Kristin, and then I'll go back perhaps with some other questions. Jill, do you want to pose your question? Then we'll go to Kristin, then we'll turn to you guys. And by Kristin, sure. I mean Kristin from CMU. Go ahead, Jill.
Yeah. Thank you both for coming to speak with us today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I would say that my question has to pertain to the impact of this new digital age, and how, you know, tech is becoming more and more prevalent, and has been super useful in doing things like youth protests and things like that. I was wondering how you see technology impacting your organizations, as well as do you see any areas that the growing technology gap is hindering some of the projects you're working on? Thank you.
So positives and negatives of the digital age. Kristin?
Sure. Well,
sorry. Kristin, CMU question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you wanted me to answer, Jill.
We'll get to you.
Go ahead, Kristin.
Understandable. It's so great to meet both of you virtually, and thank you for both of your perspectives. My question is building off of that earlier question of how do you include youth in decision-making processes, particularly within governments. So I've worked in a lot of nonprofit spaces, and I really feel like non-governmental organizations are kind of leading the way, and advisory boards, and thinking about how can you intentionally include youth in decision-making processes. But when we look at the American government, you have to be a certain age to vote, a certain age to be a politician, and a lot of the ways that I've seen youth exercising their voice is through protest and through trying to influence from the outside. Are there any best practices or international examples of ways that governments who claim to really want to incorporate youth voice into the decision-making process to be proactive instead of reactive in actually making that a reality and doing so in an inclusive and intentional way?
Those are both great questions, Mariama. I see you, but let's go first to Kristin Lord and Susan, and then we'll come back to you in a second.
Susan, I'm happy to take the first one, and I wonder if you want to take the second one, or whichever one you want. But Jill, I already started to answer you, so I'll start with you. I would say that on the whole, technology has been a huge asset in youth engagement and in leveling the playing field. I mean, it is when you're working internationally, I can say even in my own organization, we can have a meeting now with people of every age, every level, countries around the world. Everybody's the same size box on the screen. For me, it's a microcosm of what is possible when you're trying to engage youth. And we do so many programs now with young people where we can engage internationally. You don't have to afford a plane ticket. You don't have to be able to get a visa. I mean, I really think that it has so many benefits. And then to your point about youth organizing, I know we're deeply aware that a lot of the youth we've worked with in different programs, YALI is one, Young African Leaders Initiative, when there have been times when youth have come into the streets, been very powerful political movements, technology has been really instrumental in helping them to organize in a very quick way outside of formal institutions that may be very exclusive as far as youth are concerned. On the issue of just technology exclude, yes, it does. It is all too easy to forget in the world we live in now that still not everybody has access to a computer. Not everyone has access to a cell phone. A lot of the times, even if a household does have a cell phone, it is controlled by a man or it is controlled by the older male people in the household and not the younger ones. We work on some programs. One of them is called Tech Age Girls. That's really ensuring that young women in particular have those skills, have that access. It's still really important to not just make the assumption that everybody has, an iPhone at their personal disposal all the time. And so I think we need to keep our eye on that fact and also keep finding ways to have that kind of digital inclusion, because as more and more of the world moves on to digital platforms for governance, for civic engagement, for economic opportunity, if you do not have that access, you are out in the cold. You are just left out, and you're almost invisible to everybody else who feels that everybody is online, but they're not. So and people assume, especially young people, are online, but again, not necessarily the case. And the cost can be very high still in many parts of the world. So I'm going to stop there so you can hear from my friend Susan.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I think that's absolutely right. And actually in an hour, I'm going to be on a panel with a bunch of CEOs and a couple of ministers in the Caribbean to talk about digital development for young people. And one of the things to really emphasize is what Kristin was talking about is, those who do not have access or in low bandwidth areas, and what we all need to be doing. I'm really pleased to see we have 2 new corporate partners who I can't announce today, but we are investing, their tech companies, exactly in this because they know they need, there's a market out there, but we got to be able to work in a low bandwidth way, and we need to partner particularly with technology companies in order to reach them, and our work primarily around education, right? And so filling that digital skills gap as well as digital learning, digital education. So I think, a silver lining, if you will, of the pandemic is it has forced all of us, catapulted all of us, as Kristin described, really to embrace technology and digital skills. While it was part of our Transformation 2025 strategy, I got to say, we had to move a lot faster, all of us, right? Just getting to your question about governments, this unfortunately is not a silver lining. We have a lot of work to do to have young people at the table and driving policy, which is why systems change is very much part of that for IYF. And I can say where we have seen it, we see it often around issues. And so some concrete examples will be around the education systems, where they recognize working through vocational education systems. And we can't just be working on, obviously, amending the curriculum. That's where you're going to reach the most underserved populations in the globe. It's really on the policy reform. And so we have seen that actually in Mozambique, of all places. And we had a good, excellent U.S. ambassador who helped us push as well. It helps to have, this is again where diplomacy and development really worked hand in hand. And as Sarah mentioned, I served in Colombia, and we really did not see that so much during my time. There were a lot of young vice ministers and ministers, but it was different. What I've seen since under both the Duque and Petro government is really putting young people into leadership positions, whether, it's the Minister of Culture or, in different ministries, who are actually looking at young people differently as change agents and partners. And I find that very hopeful.
Before I come to Mariama, I will say that Susan and I did some work together on what I call Cohort 2030, the idea that the generation that has the most to gain or lose from the Sustainable Development Goals is the younger generation, and that to the extent that we have a future forward-looking policy agenda, it is the SDGs. And I sometimes wonder, as we are governed both in the administration, but also many members of Congress are not of a younger generation, right? So they may not feel the kind of urgency that the SDGs clearly have. And you'll hear that from me tomorrow in testimony in Congress. The moment is right now. We cannot wait. So to the extent that we can have youth voices also echoing that, it would be really helpful. Mariama, let's hear from you, and then Andrew, and then I may circle back with a question or two. Mariama, over to you.
Thanks. Hello. You both mentioned hiring a lot of young people to your staffs and having them in the board meetings and a lot of local young leaders instead of airdropping in American development experts and all of that. I'm wondering a bit about what that on-the-job training looks like for those staff, and also one of you, I think it was Susan, mentioned a bit about having to sort of hype up your young board members, what that looks like to get them to feel confident in the room with those, corporate giant kind of people.
I'm happy to go first. Thanks for the question, Mariama. First of all, let me tell all of you, and please tell your friends, IREX is hiring 57 open positions around the world right now. A lot of those, the vast majority of those in the US and around the world are positions appropriate for young people. So please apply, www.irex.org. And we do a lot of professional development training for our staff. We do mentoring, really exactly what that looks like. Some of it is standard across IREX, some of it is more case by case and country by country, depending on what's needed. But we have so many opportunities open, and we do understand that people do need to learn on the job. It's natural, but talented young people are also very quick learners. So please spread the word. We are happy to have you on board.
And I'll continue with the public service announcement. Same thing, lots of open positions, IYF.org, and you can see that for yourselves. I guess, to go directly to your question of how to prepare, one, for our team members who are joining, and all coming from their own life experiences, right, is I've done lots of orientations throughout my career as I skipped around to different missions and bureaus and whatnot. IYF, hands down, has the best orientation. That is very thorough, very in-depth, very hands-on. I love that about our organization. And so just want to assure everyone, you get better orientation coming to IYF than if you join. Hopefully it's gotten better in the US government. But the second thing is partnering and buddying. There's the mentoring relationship, there's the supervisory relationship, but there's nothing like those people you meet when you're starting out your career and you're paired up with, or you informally network with. And so we create lots of different ways to do that, and virtually. And as Kristin said, we can now do that globally, which is kind of cool, because before I think it was too US centric, headquarters centric, and then the country offices. To get to your question on the board members, we now have an intensive orientation for our youth board members. So they go through, frankly, a more rigorous selection process to get onto the board, which I think helps prepare them for the board and gets them to meet the board members in advance of joining the board. And then we go through an intensive orientation for them. We fly them here to the US. We have them spend time with our board members and on committees outside of the board meetings. The other thing I love, because it's so much better to have them on panels or doing videos than someone like me, right? So they feel a sense of opportunity. You have to create opportunities for your board members, regardless of their age, but you really have to create it for young. There has to be something in it for them. And frankly, what it helps is being able to help them elevate their voice and their power and their change agents. So it's fun. It's a lot of time, it's resources, but it's all well worth it.
We're going to hear from Andrew and Jacob, and then I'm going to come back to you guys with some questions. Andrew.
Perfect. Thank you both so much for being here this afternoon. My question is around sort of the wealth and assets around the country, and how those wealth and assets are predominantly located in the older generation and not the youth generation, specifically physical assets. And how do you see sort of that disproportionate allocation of wealth, specifically in physical aspects, impacting youth's ability to make changes and make structural policy changes, as a lot of policy changes do go hand in hand with where the money lies and who is sort of pushing those issues, both in their personal life, but also with their wealth.
Jacob?
Hi, thanks so much for speaking. My question is about how, and I know that it's a little bit more homogenous, but it's obviously not all the same, but how you work with young people who might have different, political beliefs, how you engage people with different, political beliefs, different background, religions, upbringings. I'm just curious how you all deal with that.
Go
Susan,
ahead.
you want me to start this one? So on Andrew's question, great point. I would say that, speaking personally, I don't see it as inherently problematic that people have a tendency to gain more wealth as they get older. The alternative seems really bad, that as you were, if you were losing wealth as you got older, that seems to me a very insecure and unhappy thing for young people. The key, I think, really came up in the second part of your question, which is the political system wired to favor people with wealth? That's where I think the problem is. And so, for instance, in the US, which I think is an extreme outlier in the world of where wealth, it translates to political power in terms of democracies, if we could delink campaigning and political campaigns from wealth, young people would have much more impact. There are other parts of the world where, wealthy oligarchs and so on are able to exercise outsized impact. I would go after that link between wealth and politics. I hope that young people can continue to gain wealth over the period of their lives, and wouldn't want to disrupt that in any way. But the system that political power is so tied to wealth, I find is exclusive and in many ways, and it also leaves out a lot of youth voices as well. To Jacob's question about including youth from different demographics, first of all, and I didn't get a chance to say this at the outset, so I'm going to smuggle it in now. One of the reasons that I think USAID and other organizations struggle with how to incorporate the youth issue is because youth is not a single identity. It intersects with gender identity, geography, are you urban or rural, with religion, with race, with ethnicity, and so on. No one has one aspect of their identity, whether it's youth or anything else. And so, in our program, we try to make sure we are inclusive, sometimes tracking very closely. So for instance, when we are selecting participants for our large programs, we'll have, say, 38,000 applications a year just for the Young African Leaders Initiative. We're very mindful, and we track in real time data, making sure that we are representative across a whole variety of identity indicators. That's something that we do very intentionally. We also are intentional about needing to give people the skills to interact with each other. I just had a briefing from a program team yesterday where, it was a program dealing with a particular world region, and they had a lot of people from that region who hadn't encountered people with other gender identities before, or who spoke a minority language. And sometimes there can be tensions within the group, and you actually have to be very intentional about addressing that, giving people the skills to have that cross-cultural communication, setting some standards about what is okay and what is not as okay. And so that's how we address it. I could say a lot more on both those topics, but that seems like enough for now. Over to you, Susan.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add, and building on what Kristin just said, being intentional. And so, for example, at IYF, with our gender equity and social inclusion policy and how we implement that through our programs to really bring out the diversity and the inclusion and recognizing the differences, there's so much programmatically we have to do in every single program. And then internally within our organization, recognizing there are a lot of differences there. And through, again, the leadership of our diversity, equity, inclusion council, which is global, and really helps to elevate a lot of those issues. On the wealth, I just thank you for actually raising it. It's something that, as Kristin said, it really is the systemic piece of it and the political piece of it. And we work in the US. It's one of the things that pulled me to IYF after a career overseas, was really working on some of these issues at home. And, a lot of what we try and do is actually connect people of wealth or corporate leaders to these issues, and not just through money, right? It is about their personal engagement. And so if you look at IYF's board and previous board members, you'll see how we have tried to do that through our board, but also through just, getting them out into the communities, whether that's in Washington, D.C., as last week we were at the Latin America Youth Center and Next Steps Charter School. So they really had a firsthand understanding and are moved in order to really realign their assets to these areas. So we try and do that in a deliberate way, through our strategy, because I think the point you're making is something that's critical.
Thanks for all these questions. I want to pivot a little bit to the Hill for just staying with politics. You guys tag team on the Hill. Tell us about that and tell us who the champions are.
Susan, I think you better lead on this one. You're the chair.
Well, yeah, right now on advocacy. So Kristin and I co-chair the Alliance for International Youth Development. So wherever you go in your careers, talk to them about that important alliance. And a lot of the work we've done over the last several years has been really on the Hill to help elevate the issue of the importance of investing in young people. And what we found was pushing an open door. And some of the critical members now, a couple of years later, who have really stood up, Congresswoman Meng from New York, an absolute leader on this issue, and we really want to keep her in that leadership position. Obviously, Senator Booker and others have just been ones who say we really need to not just invest more in terms of resources. We need to again make sure that they're at the center of these. So as Sarah is on the Hill tomorrow testifying before her committee, I think she's going to find a lot of champions because it's bipartisan. This is not an issue that is like, in these days that is dividing us. It actually brings people together on the Hill. And so we need to, develop more champions around this. Obviously, having more young leaders in Congress is key to that. And seeing a democratic shift, I think, will also help us.
Kristin, anything to add?
I would just say that it echoes what Susan said. This is not a partisan issue. It's a way that brings people together. I will say that there are some maybe some differences into what youth overlaps with. So for instance, on the Democratic side, you might see more interest in youth and LGBTQ rights, for instance. And on the Republican side, you might see more of a focus on youth and religious freedom. And so there are some distinctions, but the common thread is youth. People are very excited about engaging youth energy, about youth potential. And I think it may dial up or dial down on certain issue areas, but everybody seems to recognize how important youth are to whatever the issue is that they care about. And that is a tremendous opportunity. I will say that mobilizing around this issue is harder than it should be. Youth are everywhere. And if you look in speeches and talking points, you'll see everybody talking about youth. They're so important. The resources and the political commitment are not there. And yeah, Susan and I have co-chaired the Alliance for International Youth Development, and we're proud of what we've done. But honestly, this is a scrappy little organization by people who volunteer their time. There is not this juggernaut pushing for youth voice and resources for youth the way there is on issues related to, say, women and girls, or even LGBTQ rights in some quarters. There are other demographics that get a lot more attention. Youth tend to be in the speeches, but not in the budgets. And one of the ways all of you can help is if you make sure that youth do get that attention when you're working in policy areas, but also that the money's there as well, because it does take money, and budgets often are an expression of priorities. So I just wanted to add that piece.
So yesterday I participated in the annual 17 Rooms Brookings Rockefeller flagship, and we were joined by a senior UN official who was very jazzed about the faith-based coalitions that she sees out there, that they are very intergenerational. They're very diverse, and it's kind of an untapped series of networks that I thought was really interesting. I wasn't expecting to hear that, but it made me think, right, we need to remember that the faith-based can really open up. Speaking of bright spots, let's talk a little bit before we close. we live in tough times, right? But there are bright spots. There are bright spots domestically, internationally. Can you reflect on some of those? Who wants to start?
To you, Susan. I'm happy to start, or you
Go
can.
go right ahead. Go for it.
I'll pick two, and then I know you'll. I'm just pitching you a softball that you'll hit out of the park. If I had to pick one thematic and one regional area, the thematic I would say would be climate. I think there's a tremendous amount of energy around the climate issue by youth. I think a lot of the messaging, the engagement, the policy attention is being driven by youth. I think there's a lot more to be done there. And I really hope that young people will continue to be those powerful voices that they have been to date. Regionally, I would say if I had to pick one place where youth have had an outside influence, it would be sub-Saharan Africa. The average age of an African is 19 years old. This is a place where within 2 years of people going through a Young African Leaders Initiative program, they become government ministers, where we're seeing young people take leadership roles. They're running companies, they're running nonprofits, they have positions of political power. Young people are driving so much positive change in sub-Saharan Africa. And if we can just support them and get out of their way, we will see just a wealth of positive outcomes for the whole continent.
We are so excited about the MasterCard Foundation's investment in CMU Africa, and really hope that there's continued connection both between CMU Africa and those of us from CMU in the US, but also with your organizations. I think there's a huge potential to do a lot of exciting things. Susan, over to you.
Yeah, I'll just tell one story. I mean, as Kristin said, there are so many, but what really struck me when the pandemic hit, and like IREX, we have thousands of fellows we work with around the world, and our fellows are all social entrepreneurs. And we had an alumni council, and I told the team, I said, get the alumni council of social entrepreneur leaders on the phone. I want to hear, how are they doing? What do they need? So in the first weeks of the pandemic, I was sitting outside, as a matter of fact, listening to them. And they just said, we have to pivot all our work in order to address the pandemic in our communities. And so our role at IYF is to connect. Simple, connect young people to opportunities. But that meant, okay, Susan, team, let's get on the phone. Let's find out where the resources are that we can get it to this young social entrepreneur network, more than 3,000. And so we were fortunate. Conrad Hilton Foundation stood up, Burberry stood up, put together, a pot of funding. And out of that came, again, getting the funding quickly to them so that they could do things. I'll just tell you one story related to that. But there are so many, as Kristin said. And, one is this young man named Mo from Uganda, who was really suffering. He was a social entrepreneur, part of our program, but really suffering with the pandemic, and actually disappeared for about a week or so. And his family found him. He was going through a major depression. And when he saw the opportunity to actually do something, as opposed to just wallow in my world is falling apart, my community's world is falling apart, he's able to access that and created a whole program for young people using sport. So Sarah will love that as well, in order to help them with, obviously, the depression and a lot of the mental health challenges that were coming along as a result of the pandemic. And he was able to scale that up then, most importantly, through his community, leverage USAID funding. So I love hearing stories like that, and scale it up into other communities. And again, using not only the social enterprise that he had developed, and sport and life skills with some tools that we had given them. And it was like, wow, here was a situation where, it could have really gone badly, right? I mean, and the world could have lost an amazing leader like Mo. He was someone we invited to our board meeting. I'm like, Mo, talk to the board, tell them your story, just tell your story. So there are so many stories out there. And that's what I think inspires both Kristin and I every day.
You both are bright spots for us. The work that you guys are doing is amazing, and I think that in tough times, it's really important for everybody to remember that there are organizations like this and their leaders like this who are thinking positively and working with their communities to engage. Any final thoughts? We've got a few seconds left. Anything you want to impart?
Good luck to all of you. We need your help and your leadership. I think we have to be careful, though, that we don't make it sound like, well, our generation screwed up, so it's all on you. Sorry and best wishes. I think we really need to both pass batons, but also be supportive and give the space to learn. It's not realistic. Sometimes I think we talk as if we're just going to say, oh, here's the baton, good luck to you. I would like to think there's much stronger support network, and as people are sort of evolving into different kinds of roles. So I would just add that.
Yeah, and just thanks not only to all of you who joined today, and I know it's being recorded, but to the amazing CMU team, Sarah, that you lead, and the work that you're doing at Heinz. It's so critically important to prepare our, you guys are already the emerging leaders of today, and as Kristin said, we're here to support you.
When I was at AID, I had the opportunity to get to know a program that the Nike Foundation supported called the Girl Effect. And when I was describing it to a friend, she said, gosh, that's an awful lot of pressure to put on adolescent girls that they're going to change the world. So I take that very seriously, that it's not just handing it off, good luck, best wishes, but it's partnering. So thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, and be safe, be well. See you next time. Bye.
Bye, all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.